everybody. Hey, even more people came while I was out of the room. All right, fantastic. So welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming to our presentation. My name is Paul Marty. I'm a professor in the School of Information at Florida State University. Happy to see so many of you. This is Castle Kim. He's a doctoral student at the same school, and we're here to talk to you today about what we hope you will find to be a rather interesting question, which is how does the annual MCN conference reflect MCN itself as a professional organization, as a community of practice? What do we do here? What do we talk about here? And how has that changed over the last 50 years? Now, when we began this research, come on, Catherine, come on in, come in. Now, I should pause here and say that officially we now have more people in the room for the 50 years of MCN conference than we had at Museums of the Web for the 20 years of Museums of the Web presentation. It's true. Rob, you were on that panel, right? I know, it was like, well, it was the panel talking to each other about 20 years of Museums of the Web history, right? Okay, so when we began this research, we thought that our focus would be primarily on the topic of the presentations, right? Sounds like an interesting question. But as we worked through the materials, it turned out that it wasn't really as much of an interesting question as we thought it was going to be. Primarily because what we talk about here really hasn't changed all that much over the last 50 years. So, if you've studied the history of museum computing, right, you know that while the technologies that we use in museums have changed tremendously, our goals, our dreams, our aspirations with these technologies have not necessarily changed all that much. Now, certainly I'd argue that our attitudes toward technology may have changed. At the very least, seeing technology in a museum is a lot less unusual these days. It's not unexpected. It's taken as a given. Obviously, we have different tools in our toolboxes. We're not using punch cards anymore, right? But even this title could easily be a title of a talk today, right? And we owe a lot to Chanel, obviously, for the work that he did too. So we're still concerned about our messages. We're still concerned about our visitors, our resources, our collections. We're still wrestling with metadata and educational outreach, digital technologies. We're still trying to record information about our collections, reach out to our audiences, connect people, information through technology. And if you look at the titles of various MCN talks over the years, okay, you'd be hard-pressed to point out when a lot of these actually took place. Let's go ahead, let's give it a try. I'll just pick a few random ones. Interactivity and design principles in museums. There we go. Introduction to interactive multimedia applications.
2001.
3D modeling, computer modeling for museum applications. Computers and museum collection management.
1972.
Empowering the visitor at the museum website.
1996.
How about the automated collection of the future?
1976.
Digital libraries and museums and galleries. We got more people coming in. We'll keep the game going for a minute. Right? Assessing how computer interactives affect exhibition behavior.
That's going to be a early one, 91.
Intellectual property rights and museum images. Let's see, what are some of the ones I missed? Collections on the move. This should really be a bingo game, right? Yeah.
That'll take 3D computer modeling for thousands.
Okay, great. Yes. Data processing for information storage and retrieval in museums.
1967.
Whoa. Yeah, I know. That's always going to be your answer for everything, right? Right. The future of the museum is a learning environment.
2020.
Okay, here are the answers. All right. So, which, if anything, shows you how random and unpredictable a lot of this is. What? Sorry? Or how sticky they are, right? Now, I'm sure you got a lot of these right. I think you did get a lot of these right within a few years at least. But I do wonder how many people in this room realize that not a single one of the talks that I picked was given within the last 20 years, right? Unless you count the 1998 as being within the last 20 years, but I don't. And the fact is that unless there's a specific technology named in the talk, or unless there's a specific project named in the talk, dating a presentation based on the title, based on the theme, is nearly impossible. We just keep using generic, let's share the wealth, right? Right, let's keep sharing the wealth. Why not? We'll just keep doing it over and over and over again. And this goes all the way back, as Rob keeps saying, to the beginning. And if you read the proceedings of MCN's first conference, which is freely available online through OCLC and lots of other places, you'll see that the speakers there were wrestling with so many of the same issues that we're wrestling with today. It's really, really fascinating. So as we worked through the materials that we had, and as we began our research, our expectations about what we were going to find with this project and what we were going to be able to say at this conference changed dramatically. And these changes were driven in part by the methodological difficulties we encountered collecting the information we needed to do this research in the first place. As you know, this annual meeting is a meeting without a published proceedings. So if you want to actually analyze the conference programs, it's hard to do when there isn't a published proceedings. Setting aside a few issues of spectra that often included some scattered conference details, this 1968 conference proceedings is the only full proceedings published from this conference. It's kind of amazing. As an academic, I find this to be a fascinating example of gray literature. Right? Where is the sum total of the body of knowledge of the 50 years of this organization kept? A professional community lives or dies on the strength of its common body of professional knowledge. And when that knowledge isn't saved or isn't archived in an easily accessible location, how do you go? Where do you proceed? Well, in our case, you rely upon the wonderful kindness, encouragement, and amazing institutional knowledge of many of the people who have supported and built this organization over the years. Right? See, I told you Marla to have a picture of you on there, right? Obviously, these are just some of the, and you've seen this picture before now, right? Because it's been floating around a lot of places. Just some of the many dedicated MCN members who worked every day to make sure the history of this organization is preserved. Thanks to Darren and David and Diane and Leslie and Marla and Charles. Here they are preparing to go into the first, I believe, archives dive at the Smithsonian earlier this year. And there's many other people that should be thanked. Chuck and Richard, Andrea and Susan and Rob and Kathy Jones. And the list goes on and on and on of people who have been trying to uncover the history of this organization and digging through boxes in their garage. And that's oftentimes really what it comes down to. Rob and I were just talking at dinner last night. I need you to dig up the 1995. That's what I need. I need 1995, man. And as a quick aside, a lot of these people are working right now to try to preserve our existing conference history and to gather it all into one centralized, easily accessible location, so that hopefully 50 years from now, when somebody's trying to talk about 100 years of this conference, it's going to be easier at least to find the documents. And we've done a good start by collecting things on the past conferences page on the MCN website. So now at least all the conferences / annual meetings are listed there. And we just recently put pretty covers up for as many of them as we had them, and we are slowly working on linking what we have in terms of programs to these. So at least there will be one central location where you can go to find at least an access to who was speaking, maybe what the titles of the talks were, and things like this. Now, collecting these resources was not at all easy. Right? So in addition to diving into archives and garages, right, it also involved wading through a ton of historical documents describing the development of MCN as an organization, and documents that were fascinating because they provided a window to the thoughts and the experiences of the members of this community over the years, but also frustrating in that they often barely just scratched the surface of what we know was out there. In any sort of historical project. You're familiar with this, right? So here we have this on the left. This is from 1984. It's a draft document about the organization. Here in the middle, this is Marla's favorite letter. This is the letter that David Vance sent to Ron Clay saying, "Dear Ron, you have been elected to the office of Vice President effective October 22, 1982, so pray for me." But one of the things that these documents also show, too, is this changing nature of the organizational body, right? So here we have, this is from 1987, voting privileges extended to individual members, right? Which is a lot later than a lot of people might have thought that it was. So as we work through these materials, we realize that the history of the conference is much more than a record of what we talked about here, what we did here. It documents the evolution of MCN as a professional community and the development of an international community of practice of information professionals dedicated to supporting information and communication technologies in museums. In other words, it documents not just what we do here, but why we do it at all. Why are we meeting here in the first place? And as we talked about this, we circled around and we landed on sort of 3 driving research questions to govern the work that we were doing. So number one, how is this conference changing? If we look over 50 years, how has the conference changed over time? Actually turns out to be a really interesting question. Two, how have those changes paralleled the changes in the organization? How do they feed back upon each other in a form of coevolution? And three, how does the evolution of this conference over time inform the development of this community of practice? Because that is one of these critical things. I should plug that little thing upstairs where you put the little stickers on the boards and put your little sticker on the board. It was fascinating. What? Sorry?
Have you done it?
I did it, yes, absolutely. And it was fascinating to look at some of the splits between, because the stickers are color-coded based on how long people have been coming here to the organization, right? To the conference. And it was fascinating to me to see that people who are new at the conference have been tagging professional development, and people who have been here for a long time are tagging professional communities, right? Because so much of this is about the evolution of a community of practice. So much of this is about, especially for the person who's the one and only information technology professional at their institution, to be able to stand up and say, I belong to this group. There's a group of people who stand behind me, who support what I am doing, and are validating the work that I'm doing. It's almost like joining a union, right? With cheaper dues. So these are lofty, big picture questions, and I don't want to imply in any way, shape, or form that we can answer them all right now, but these are guiding the work that we're doing. So we're going to show you now our preliminary results. And Council, you want to talk about some of the stuff we've got here?
So, from the programs that we were able to gather and documents we were able to gather, we took a backward approach and then forward. So I mainly dove into all the PDFs that we've gathered, and here we have the 2000s. Pretty straightforward. 2000s were well documented. A lot of people have been going. We were able to get the scanned documents, and we have good. What was it? Oh.
We're different heights.
So to 2000 is well documented. A lot of people still have the program. We were able to get PDF documents, and also they had good abstracts, good records of who were speaking, and also some of, in recent years we still have the videos uploaded on YouTube. We were able to track back, but then we go into the early 2000s. Gets a little bit bulkier, but still we still have good glossy programs bounded, and one of my favorite has to be 96. Because that's the only program that was printed landscape. It was a horizontal.
This one right here.
That one. That's one of my favorite programs that I found. And then when we go into the 90s, that's when it got a little bit challenging. In the 90s, there were only few complete programs that I was able to dive in through. I got a couple of programs where I only had the cover page, especially the 95 program. If we could get that, that would be great. And then we got couple of years where we only had the Spectra, the first page of Spectra that didn't go into page 2 or 3, just the first page, and then that was mainly it with 90s. So it got a little bit complicated, but enough information to get an overview of what the 90s were like. Then we jump into the 80s. The 80s, less programs. There were more of single-page programs that had a listing of the schedules, of the title of the talks, and the name of the presenters. And then a couple of the programs that we did have, still we only have the cover page. Let's see. And then some of them we didn't even have the programs. We had a call out for registration forms saying that, oh, we're going to be doing this, this, and this here. You should come. Or schedule with a registration. It was a single pamphlet looking like a document. Then the black hole 70s. 70s, the conference format really jumped into the 80s, and the 70s were mainly about annual board meetings. So in 1978, I believe the document we have clearly states it's the 6th annual board meetings. So we know there was 5 before, but we just don't have the programs. And all the programs that we have were just a agenda, a schedule of like what will be happening during that meeting. Oh, a president's report, a president's talk, a treasurer's report, etc., etc. Then we jump into the 1960s, where we actually have the first published proceedings for the 68 conference, but we know MCN was founded in 67. Programs for 68. MCN was founded in 67, but we don't have anything for 69. We don't know there was a conference or a meeting. Currently we don't have any documents
As far as
relating
we
to
know,
it.
there was nothing in 69. There was a big workshop in 1970. The express purpose of the workshop was to try to drum up support for MCN as a network. It failed, right? There was no meeting in 71. MCN was incorporated in 72, and then the annual meeting started after that.
And
The history is a lot more complicated than that. But
And this was the MCN was all led with the integration of technology, especially with the Griffos and Griffos integrating into the museums. Then after overviewing from forward and backwards of the history, I went from backwards all the way forwards again, taking a look at critical incidents, critical events, any repeating patterns that were happening, and what I noticed, and Dr. Marty, we found that the trends of the MCN had a co-evolution with the organization, with the community, and with the conference itself. They all morphed and changed together. So it wasn't one after another. Those transitions were happening around the same time, and those were reflected within the programs.
So Castle dove through all of this. I'm going to go back one before they start reading all that text. So Castle dove through all of this data and came up with all of these charts and stuff. And then he and I sat down and we tried to make sense out of all this raw data, which was tough, right? And really complicated. So we ended up sort of grouping this in the 4 major sort of evolutionary trees that we tried to govern different aspects of how the co-evolution of the conference, the community, and the organization ran. So the first tree really looks at this question of who are we, right? Where do we come from? What's our identity? And this is really a fascinating question because you can see the co-evolution of the organization and its identity through the good and the bad. Now, I know you're probably from back there, you certainly can't see the words, but what we have coming on here, right? So we're coming out of this early era of museum computing, which drives the foundation of MCN, right, as a grant-funded network. And the challenges that it runs into, which leads to its eventual incorporation, and then the challenges that runs into that leads to its new model of voluntary leadership in '86, which we have now. And you can see those turning points, those transformations, those difficulties expressed in the conference programs themselves. You can see the optimism in the first conference. You can see the challenges in those early workshops. I mentioned the 1970 workshop, which had an explicit purpose, said there, of to acquaint people with the activities and findings of the network. And the whole reason they were getting people together was because they were trying to let people know what it was that was actually happening. All of this is coming down to presenting a vision of identity. I mean, so much of these early days is visioning. Right? Who are we? Why are we doing this? You read the stuff that Jack Heller wrote. You read a lot of the things that Everett Ellen was writing. All of it is presenting a vision moving forward. And you see the challenges as this vision fails, right? And gets reinvented, and fails again, and gets reinvented. But the vision continues on as we move from an institutional membership model that clearly is not going to survive to an individual membership model. As we move from annual meetings of the institution members to annual conferences that reflect the individual identity, and how so much of that changes over time to reflect new ways of outreach. And many of these new outreach methods to change who we are connect to big changes, big evolutionary changes. Reaching out to local chapters, encouraging regional meetups, reaching out to new members, starting scholarship programs, reaching out to emerging professionals, having joint conferences with lots of other groups. That's something that starts right in the very early 1990s. Again, trying to build these connections, trying to build these bridges to shape our identity, to shape who we are. You see it in the evolution of the name. This transition right here around 1980 was very fascinating to me to see, because that's over a period of 3 years where we go from being the annual meeting of MCN to the annual meeting and conference to the MCN conference. As that identity shifts, 78, 79, 1980, 1981. These are all important angles on who we are, and it's just fascinating to see how that shapes our identity. So the next tree we were looking at was, why are we here? And that really comes down to what do we want? What are the problems that we're trying to solve? What are we trying to accomplish? So much of that is driven by these transformations that reflect the changing technologies of the time. Much of what's covered at the conference, what we expect to learn, to do, our expectations, they're driven by and they reflect the changing needs of our populations and the changing technologies that people are coping with. In other words, what I'm underscoring here is what we're doing at this conference is not random. Right? What we talk about here is connected to outside forces. I put a few of the key things here as we move from mainframe systems to the PC revolution, the databases and data sharing and the influence of the World Wide Web and how all of that connects. you can see as we move from a world where we have sequential talks and papers, that one unrelated, two related panels and sessions, two our first congruent tracks in the early 2000s where you had to choose, do I go here or do I go there, right? Fascinating to see where we first had to make that particular choice. Where do we start explaining to people why they're here, what their goals are? Right? You know, the first president's welcome that shows up in the program. The first time the program explains to the attendees what this organization is, why it even exists, right? Because you know, that's one of these key things that you don't even think about, right? When the program first starts explaining what the institution, what the organization is, that's when you realize that there are people coming to this program, coming to this conference, who don't know what this organization is, right? We have to start telling them. I was fascinated to see where the official themes started, right? Early 90s, I can't remember the exact date. I have to go back through the numbers. Because so much of that is, again, trying to sell, how do you convince your boss that you should come to this particular place? What are the opportunities to? What are the goals? What are you going to learn? Why come here? How do you justify your attendance? This flurry of activity here that came out of the late 90s, early 2000s. So many changes of what we're trying to do. Again, I'm sorry, you can't read. Open forums, case studies, showcases, town hall meetings, professional forums, roundtable discussion, unconference sessions, hack days, right? This amazing flurry, all that comes out of this initial sequence of talks and papers, panels, sessions, congruent tracks. This, where the first keynote speakers show up, where the first plenary sessions show up. Opening and closing, and how that reflects what we're trying to do as we build a community, as we build some continuity from year to year. The very first conference is where we start promoting the next year's conference in the conference program, right? Again, you know, why did we wait until the mid-2000s to start doing that? All right, what does that say about us as a community and building that connection from year to year? And that connection, that really speaks to this question of what do we need, all right? So the previous tree looked at what are our wants? Why are we here? This is dealing more with what are we trying to do? How do we make that work? What do we need to do our jobs? And how does MCN help us get the tools, the knowledge, and the expertise that we need to do our jobs? And of course, what's fascinating to me is we started grouping all of this emerged post 1979, right? Post 1980. This reflects the individual membership of this particular conference. Right? We need tools, we need software, we need hardware, we need resources, tools that we're dependent on, what? Okay, I'm going fast. Tools that are dependent, I'll go faster. Tools that are dependent on vendors, exhibitors, demos, right? There's a whole evolution here. Where does this come from? System demos, the very first exhibit halls, the vendor demo marathons, which I'm sorry I missed. It's like, was just a lot of fun. How many people were there for some of those? Anybody? No, I mean, that's early 90s, right? Right, the changing terminology, sponsors, exhibitors. Who's an exhibitor? Who's a sponsor? What does that changing terminology mean when it shows up in the program? Our very first conference workshops, 1985, Mexico City, right? First pre-conference workshop, right? The evolution of special interest groups in the 1980s. Things like birds of a feather luncheons, the speed networking that started, right? And of course, I'm also fascinated by how we build these connections to find the expertise that we need. And there's this sort of shift in technology where we suddenly start seeing hospitality suites and message boards and email centers and wait for people to connect, and then all that disappears, right? Because now we're carrying around the email center with us, or now we're carrying around the message boards with us. And that speaks to this final tree of connection, right? How do we do this? How do we see from the conference program how the conference helps us build these personal relationships, the relationships that we need to succeed? How do we socialize? How do we interact? It's important that this conference is not just talks. And you see this in the historical documents. One of my favorites, the write-up in 1987 in Spectra, from the 1987 conference, Dr. Fletcher from the UK Museum Computer Group wrote about how good it is to see MCN's resurgence. Right, because this is after the challenge of 1984, SUNY, if you know the history, right? Craziness, all right? And then 1986 was such a huge watershed year for this conference turning around. And here he is coming over for the 87 conference. It's so good to see this conference going back. But he says he was distressed that there weren't social events. Right? Weren't enough. So the principal object, I'm quoting him here, the principal object of going to conferences like this is to meet people. Unfortunately, this proved difficult because of the very tight program with no breaks and no catering arrangements. The absence of any evening events, social or otherwise, was very disappointing. And he was very British in his writing, too. You could tell, right? Well, we fixed that, right? And the funny thing is, we had fixed that for a long time, but with the ups and downs of the conference, we started with cocktail receptions, and we have plenty of official receptions and official tours. But then we slowly start seeing, we're going to have silent auctions, we're going to have cash bar. The cash bar turns into pub crawls, that turns into karaoke, right? We have the Ignite session, which is such an amazing recent event that's going on. We have the connections through media, right? The evolution of the MCN news column in Spectra, the evolution of Spectra to being an MCN only document. The evolution of Spectra and the guest edited special issues after Suzanne Quigley retires, and how that then drops off after 2002. And at the same time, in the mid-90s, we got the emergence of the listserv, the website, and where we start showing up on social media. Flickr was first, by the way, right? Before anything else. And then we're getting all the social media, and then we start promoting the MCN hashtag. How do we connect? Right? We had lists of speakers from the beginning, but contact information only shows up in the late 80s, right? Speaker bios don't start until 2000. Right? At what point did we reach as an organization where we no longer assume that everybody knows everybody else? Right? And what does that say about us as an organization? So when we look at what happens at the MCN conference, not just what people are talking about or presenting on, but how they're engaging with each other, how our meetings are structured to encourage that sort of interpersonal institutional engagement, we see how MCN has developed as a community over 50 years. And when we look at those 50 years, we see a conceptual shift, a trend in the overall purpose of the conference from informing users about technology to engaging a group of professionals around a common interest to inspiring a community of practice that transcends borders, transcends institutions, transcends nations. A trend that in a fit of pique I decided to call the 3 evolutionary pillars of the MCN conference. And it's important to stress that we're looking at this evolutionary lens not as an organization, not as a conference, but as an individual, right? And that the evolution of our community represents this shift. We're not about museums, right? We're about people. And yeah, you can see the evolutionary progression in the organization itself, MCN as an organization, from very early grant-funded institutional members to a model of individual members with a voluntary leadership board. But more important is this evolution at work in the minds of each individual member's relationship with the organization, with the conference. And this is key, because as each individual member becomes a part of this community of practice, they're engaging with this community, they're engaging with this organization through an evolutionary process that works through these pillars. Right? They're here to learn, they're here to get engaged, they're here to get inspired. And we see this in the stickers upstairs on those things, right? We see that transition happening right there. And as we work through answering these research questions, as we keep diving into these documents that we have, we're looking broadly at these transitions, these trends as represented in the conference program, to see how the coevolution of the conference, the organization, the community goes along, and in so doing to define the future of this organization. Thank you very much. Told you I could do it.